Thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Building Stronger Relationships with Families. My name is John Kronstein. Mr. K is what the kids know me as, so in my stories you may hear me refer to myself as Mr. K. And I'm a school counselor in Charlottesville City Schools. Thanks so much for joining us again, and let's get started. So let's look at our intentions for today, our learning intentions and learning goals. The first is to discuss the difference between being authentic and being genuine with families and why it matters when building relationships. The next is to self-reflect about the particular barriers keeping you who are attending this webinar today from building genuine, authentic, and positive relationships with families. And lastly, we want to create some actionable steps that you can take and spread to your staff to build and empower stronger relationships with families. And that could be through the discussion questions that you use by yourself or in small groups following this webinar, notes you take throughout. But none of these webinars mean anything if there's not something that you can take from it to immediately put into place, hopefully, or challenge some practice that you already do in your building to help build stronger practice. And as a side note, based on some best practices that I've learned from some other virtual reading pieces, you may at times see my eyes gaze downwards. I have a few things below me on my desk. The first is a clock keeping track of the time to make sure I don't keep us here all day. The second is my notes that I may look down at. I am in my building, and so hopefully nobody comes through that office door. I've let just a couple of us who are in the office know, but just know those may be the things that happen in our time together, and I'll pause and hope to minimize those distractions. You know, I feel like we have to begin here and affirm the fact that all of you here watching are amazing rock stars. You're amazing counselors, social workers, psychologists, nurses, and any other profession who may have jumped on to watch. You do amazing work. You've chosen a vocation that puts you interacting with students and families, often at their most vulnerable times, often at their most challenging and needy times. So kudos to you, and you have to always stop and remind yourself of the whys. Why'd you go into this work, even on the hard days, even on the pandemic days, which we're going to be living in for a little while, and we have already been living through. So just remember, at any time during this, you can pause this webinar and just say, I've got this. I'm a rock star, and I believe in you, and I believe you are one. All right? So what exactly does our agenda look like for our time together? First, we're going to look at some position statements, and as I said in another webinar, or will say depending on what order you watch these in, it may seem a little nerdy, but I think it's important to look at what do our professional associations say when it comes to working with families, so that you all know that this is not just what me, Mr. K, thinks we should be doing with families. We're going to talk about why it's important to build these strong school-family relationships, the hows. We're going to do a little bit of time talking about who should be making contact with families or who is making contact. We're going to look at the barriers that often exist or have been created between ourselves, the school, and families. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the use of data and why that's important in this work. All right, strap yourselves in. It's going to be great. All right, school counselors, you're up first. This comes from our School Counseling Professional Association. School family community partnerships have increased the successful academic, career, and social emotional development of all students. School counselors are called to create, lead, facilitate, and assess these partnerships and work to remove barriers to these helpful collaborative relationships. Kind of mirrors maybe the setup I used for this webinar today. All right, school psychologist, you're here next. The benefits of partnering across home and school are well supported in the scientific literature. School-family partnerships focus on coordination, consistency, and continuity across families and educators through effective communication, joint problem solving, active involvement, and shared decision making. I love that sentence. Way to go, school psychologists. It says school psychologists have a vital role in building and sustaining school-family partnerships. I like that sustaining word. The National Association of School Psychologists is committed to creating and enhancing partnerships between all families and educators to promote positive outcomes for all children and youth. That's an awesome statement. I love that one. School social workers, yours actually gave some bullet points of ways to engage families. So this is under the role of school social worker, services to parents and families. School social workers work with parents to facilitate their support and their children's school adjustment. They work to alleviate family stress to enable the child to function more effectively in the school and community. They work at assisting parents to access programs available to students with special needs. And school social workers work to assist parents in accessing and utilizing school and community resources. All right, school nurses. This comes from a 21st century document about kind of reimagining school nursing. The school nurse promotes family and school partnerships working together to support and improve learning by sharing opportunities to get involved at school and within the broader community. School nurses take a leadership role in collaborating with community partners to identify and provide programs to meet the physical and mental health needs of children and families. They can help strengthen collaboration among agencies and stakeholders to review and analyze community data to help make informed decisions. And I know I just read those from the screen for everyone. Sometimes when somebody else reads something like this to me, there are words that stick out that maybe wouldn't have if I just read them myself. And the idea of sticking them up here and just pausing and saying, I'm going to give you 40 seconds to read that now. Maybe if we were in a classroom where I could read the room and see how you were doing and adjust from there. But thanks for humoring me with these position statements. But our associations really have come out and said that all of us are in leadership roles to make sure to effectively engage family partnerships with the school and to eliminate barriers, to connect with community resources. And a great thing, and this is getting super into it, is all our associations have actually put out a joint statement of how we are all to work together in not only this work, but the work in supporting the whole child throughout their school environment. That's pretty cool. So why are these relationships important? And this may be a, well, duh, but sometimes we neglect this aspect of the relationship building. So why are they important? First of all, stronger family engagement with schools leads to higher attendance by students, higher participation, higher engagement numbers. There's positive learning outcomes for students. Students do better in school when the family and the school have positive associations and relationships. There's a lower risk for dropout for students if the family and the school is engaged in a positive relationship, in a strong relationship. It helps to build a support network in case of crisis. Our families and our schools experience significant crises throughout a student's life and throughout the period of our work in schools. And if we don't have a relationship with the family and they have something meaningful happen in their life where we could truly be a support and help alleviate some of the stress or even be a resource for the student during that time, then the family may not access those and it could have negative outcomes all over, that the family could just continue to be in a traumatic event without receiving help. This positive relationship helps heal historical hurts. How many times have we talked with a family who the family said, well, I went to that school and this happened. And, that classroom, I remember that classroom because so-and-so was the teacher and they hated me. They hated my friends and they hated black kids and they all of these patterns of historical hurt and distrust. And if we actively work to break down those barriers and end that cycle and trajectory of historical hurt, how amazing would that be for a family? That we start to say, no, I hear you, but here's how we've worked to disrupt that and change that. And please tell us your experience more and more so that we can make changes or just know what was. And we'll get to a little bit more of that in a moment. And lastly, it builds family agency and advocacy. I tell people all the time that my goal as a school counselor is to not exist. And all of us should almost have that same mantra in our professions, is we should really be building family agency to where they take ownership and can take ownership of their students' learning, of knowing the resources and how to access the resources in their community. And so we really work on these strong partnerships to help families navigate the future and thus helping their student navigate the future as young adults in our community. All right, so we looked at why this is important work, and maybe there were some new things in there, or maybe just some pieces that caused you to go back and question why this work is so paramount. But how? How do we do this? It starts with you. You, the mental health professional or counselor or social worker who's here today. It starts with you saying, I believe every family is amazing. It starts with you believing in the work that families can do. It starts with you helping to model best practice to the other adults in your building. That idea of assuming each family is doing their absolute best is something that didn't come to me until later in my counseling practice. That truly, when a family sends their kid to us, they trust us each and every day that they are sending and doing their absolute best. And so we almost have to look at that from a skill deficit model, right? If a child comes to us and we're seeing some reading difficulties, or we're seeing the fact that, fractions are really tough for them, we don't write them off and we don't say, well, you're unteachable or you can't learn that skill. So why do we assume that with families? Just because maybe we've had a negative interaction with a family, or we haven't been able to reach a family, that family doesn't care, doesn't give a flip. What if we instead looked at that family from a skill deficit model and tried to figure out, what are the barriers keeping that family from engaging? Are there aspects and pieces of engagement that family may just not know how to do? Being your genuine and authentic self. Being authentic is all about making sure your self-expression is true to who you are. Being genuine is making sure we remember that we want the best from everyone that we're talking to, and that we believe in the best, and that we care deeply for everyone we're talking to. Because families feel that just like kids do. Families will know the adults, oh no, that adult actually cares about me. One of my favorite stories, I had a family that told a child who was coming into our building, said, doesn't matter, you don't need to listen to anybody in that school but Mr. K. And at first I was like, oh, that's so sweet. And then I said, wait, hold on. There are a lot of other adults you should probably listen to. But I was really happy that my authentic and genuine self had come across to this family so well that they hadn't even met me yet, but they'd heard enough to know that I would care about their kid, I would take care of their kid, and communicate well. So that kid did well. They did interact well with others too, so it was great. Realizing this is a team approach. Think about all the people who are watching this webinar right now. If you're lucky enough to be watching it with other members of your school student services team, or able to talk about with other members of your student services team, or even just other fellow counselors or psychologists or social workers, that you're able to look at some systematic practices in your division in terms of building those relationships. Knowing your community, and we're going to look at something in a second of how I always approach this with new teachers and people in our division. If you don't know where your families are living, and where, not just the street address, but what does that street address mean? What surrounds that street address? If you don't know the bus lines, if you don't know the closest points of access for them, if you recommend Boys and Girls Club to them, but they don't have transportation, and that's clear on the other side of the city, and these work hours and things like that, and Boys and Girls Club, if they don't provide transportation or do, and there's all these other aspects, you could be creating another negative interaction with the family, because now you're suggesting something to them that's just not going to work, versus knowing how those pieces all work together and knowing where they are. When you're helping a family look for other housing options, or you're having a family look at community-based service options, or after-school programs, or food insecurity options that, again, based on transportation or other aspects that they can access. So knowing your community in terms of what are the resources for your Hispanic families, what are the resources for your undocumented families, what are your resources for your LGBTQ students, for families who are wanting resources to help their students with any of their needs. And so I wanted to show a map real quick. This is Charlottesville, and this is me being very transparent, right? Like Charlottesville, we've got a lot of work to do, but we're also doing a lot of work. So this is just a division of our elementary schools, into 6 different regions of the city. And like anything, if we were in person maybe and this was an hour long, I would have you take a look at this map, and as an outsider, as somebody maybe not from Charlottesville, saying, what do you notice? And some of the things, in case it's hard to see, the dark blue areas are actually areas that have a higher Black population that's above the city average. Okay? That dotted line that's in the middle is actually a railroad line. The University of Virginia, because we're in Charlottesville, is right in this area over here. So this cutout is the University of Virginia. So then you start to take a look at some things, and we can really start going into the different populations. We can look at some of those lines and how they're cut and why. We can start to look at historical patterns and busing. We can start to talk about segregation and integration and what that meant in the city of Charlottesville and how families still have institutional hurt. We can talk about land issues and home ownership issues and homes that were demolished for economic prosperity of whites. And so it completely has created huge economic gaps in the city and racial disparities and wealth gaps that are going to be really challenging to overcome with traditional policies. And you may say, wait a second, how does that have to do with building strong, supportive family relationships? If we don't understand where our families are coming from, if we have no idea what they're truly experiencing, which, to be fair, are we going to ever know what they're truly experiencing? But if we're not actively trying to understand more and more that situation, how could we possibly build that trust where they then believe that we want and have the best interest of their child and their family in our hands? So just think about that. So a couple more how do I's. A little more nuts and bolts. Best practice says that when we put communication out from the school, we should use at least 2 different methods of communication. And so that could be a sample of a couple different things. It could be call, text, email, post mail, so old snail mail, or in person. Now, typically schools will resort to what? All calls or email blasts or maybe the old school mailings. And we're going to talk a little bit about how those actually can be barriers when it comes to communication as well. But best practice is telling us that as a school, we should use at least 2 of those methods of communication. And within that, you also need to think about, what about our non-native English speakers? So a how is also you're willing to go to them. When we talk about barriers, we're going to talk about, when we talk about building strong relationships with families, our old school notion of what school is or what school hours are has to change. We have to be willing to adapt our strategies to our changing and adapting families. And that means their schedules, that means their modalities of communication, that means what we're communicating with them about. All of that has to be up for change. And so hopefully maybe right now you can pause the webinar and think how you currently communicate with families. You personally in your role, how you as a school communicate with families about certain issues. I'm thinking our school nurses and when you have to get different vaccination information out to families at those transition points. And wow, that is a heavy lift. I know I've helped our school nurse with that multiple times. I'm at that TDAP transition point, so I help with that a lot. But think about your current school practices and maybe see if you know or don't know, how does your school communicate with all families? So this is, I added late in my planning, but when we start thinking of building strong relationships with families, let's talk about who's actually making that contact. One thing we want to recognize, especially as kids get older, especially at my school, when they start having multiple teachers, middle school, high school, this is definitely an issue, is families can become overwhelmed. If all of a sudden I'm getting 4 or 5 different phone calls, and I think of this first, unfortunately, this is where my brain goes, and this is unfortunate for a lot of reasons, but think of a kid who just has a really rough day. And if they have a rough day in math class, and then they have a rough day in reading, and then they have a rough day in science, and then they have a rough day in social studies, and a parent is hearing from all 4 of those teachers in one day, what message does that portray? Now, at the same time, we all hear from those families all the time. Why haven't you told me? Why aren't you reaching out? Why aren't you letting me know? And in the same breath, almost just a day later, why are you always calling me? Why do I always hear about this? Y'all are calling me too much, all of those pieces. And I think that just goes to the overwhelmed nature. And what they're saying is they want communication, but we're not respecting the fact that Communication doesn't necessarily mean 4 and 5 different phone calls every single day. So when we think about who's making that contact, remember that families can easily become overwhelmed with too much. We want to look at this idea of case management, and we're doing this coming school year at my building, where because of the virtual learning environment we're going to be in, and we're really concerned with families and students and engagement and all those pieces, we've actually taken every adult in the school and broken our population up into what's going to be about 10 or 12 kids per adult. And we're calling them family coaches. And so you're creating these family support teams, and that way the family coach is the one who's going to be reaching out to the family every week, at least initially. How are things going? How are you accessing? What technology issues do you have? What are your difficulties engaging with the kid in terms of routine and establishing this new routine? Is there anything you want the school to know? Do you need to talk to the school counselor or the school social worker or the school nurse? Really helping them to start to be the single contact person. During the school year, when we're in person, quote, normal school year, my team, we always operate as the school counselors as your point of contact for families, especially in the middle school, upper elementary, middle school, high school range, so that we can say, look, just reach out to your school counselor. They will help connect the dots for the other pieces for you if you have a question. So along with that, when are you contacting families? Are you only contacting during working hours? And then for what? And that goes back to that original anecdote I gave earlier. Are we only contacting families when something wrong has happened? One data point that's fascinating if teachers were to do this, and you could get a couple teachers to be almost a lab group for you in your school, is, can you keep track of every student who you've contacted or every family you've contacted over the next month? And is it for an academic reason? Is it for a behavior reason or an engagement reason? And that kind of covers our 3 VTSS, MTSS domains, right? And was it a positive or was it a negative for each one of those? Was it a positive academic? I'm so impressed by how so-and-so has done and showed a lot of grit and determination, and they just rocked this test. Or was it a negative academic concern? So-and-so never does their homework. I never see them. Was it a positive behavior? So-and-so has really been doing a great job at sharing, at using their voice when they have an emotion, and using their words instead of using their fists or kicking or screaming, or they've just been an example and a leader in our community, right, in our school community. Or has it been a negative behavior call? Has it been a negative, like, I'm so excited, I saw so-and-so, they've been showing up to the virtual lessons, and that's so great, I can't wait, they just contribute so much, thank you so much for making sure they attend? Or was it negative? And it would be fascinating to look at those data points after a month and see. And I think it'd be fascinating for the teacher. And then making adjustments based off what you're seeing. But that when part is also we're going to talk about in just a little bit with barriers as well. So here we go. A lot of times we who are mental health professionals or student service team members love this. But I'm a school nurse. I can build a relationship with any family. I talk to families all the time about medications and about when they have boo-boos or when their tummy hurts or all these kind of things. I'm a school counselor. I can build a relationship with anybody. Can you? Really? Has it worked every single time? 100% of families? If so, I want to hear from you, because I want to hear more about how you build those relationships with families. And I don't mean that as a jab. I mean, seriously, I think if we truly take a look, there are families who we're not engaging and not reaching and not building a strong relationship with, and it's usually because of one of these barriers. The first could be implicit bias, intent versus impact. What is it that we are bringing of ourselves and our biases that we're bringing in our spaces, in our conversations with families, that could immediately strain that relationship, harm that relationship? And how do we notice them? How do we even know that we're projecting these kind of biases? A lot of that comes with data that we collect and data that we observe and data that we seek, which we'll talk about at the end. We look at our comfort zones when it comes with implicit bias. Am I only reaching out to the families who I know speak English because it takes me a lot of work and I don't know how to reach the families who don't speak English? Am I only willing to go to certain events in the community to reach families because it's in a neighborhood I feel safe in or I know? Working with kids and working with families demands that we get out of those comfort zones. And I would ask you to reflect on those outside of this webinar. Barriers could be trauma that our families have experienced, trauma based on any one of these. Historical distrust of the school system. We talked about that earlier, right? Historical distrust of mental health professionals or health-based professionals. Racial differences. In graduate school, I did a lot of work looking at the racial and gender power dynamic in counseling relationships, and I was mainly looking at it from the vantage point of the counselor with the student. But I think there's a lot of those pieces that can also be applied with the counselor and the family. And so I have to recognize that immediately coming into the relationship as a white male. What could that look like and mean for the family? What do I have to alter or change or realize when I go into that conversation? And sexuality differences goes right along with it. Do my lesbian or gay couples feel comfortable contacting me, feel comfortable coming into my space, feel comfortable thinking that I'm going to accept and work with them? And what have I done to make sure that I'm available and make sure that I show that I'm completely open and welcoming and an ally to all students and families and all the beautiful fabrics of families that we see? If we don't think about these intentionally, then the unintentional harm and negative relationships that can be created, I think, would be too immense. Language is a barrier. Whether it's the communication styles we're using, whether it's sometimes, especially as counselors, social workers, healthcare workers, psychologists, we can put things in very academic language because we've had a lot of training. We read a lot of articles. We go to a lot of PD. We are a very highly skilled bunch of people. Again, you're a rock star. But sometimes the language, not only language being English, Spanish, Dari, Pashto, any of the other languages that you may have in your building, but also the verbiage and how you manipulate language can be a barrier for families. So what services and access do you have or do you need? And making sure you advocate for those tools to be able to reach students and families who speak different languages. Distance. I've been thinking a lot about our rural counties, and those of you who are watching this in our rural counties, when I say go to them, you may be looking at me like, I don't think you've ever driven all the way across some of our counties. And you're right. I've never worked in a rural county. So your challenges are going to be extremely unique, and distance could very much be a barrier for parents accessing you or you accessing families. And so you're going to have to be even more creative of what does that look like and when does that happen? That also goes to that when. Are there more events, central events that you feel like get a larger gathering of people from the county to where you can be recognizable and available for families? Time of day. This goes to the when, right, that we were mentioning earlier. If your school day operates from 8 to 3 or 8 to 4, you automatically eliminate a population of parents that you're not going to be able to reach. Now, does that mean you're available to 9, 10 o'clock? Absolutely not. Self-care is an important part of this job. But I would be remiss if we didn't talk about time of day as a barrier and making sure that we're not looking at or that we are looking at the school day and the hours we contact families as the only possible times. So are we only calling when it's convenient for us? I've started texting families a lot more, and I know some people here are absolutely against that, and I understand, and I'm not saying that you have to do this. However, I have found that there are families that I can only get at 8 o'clock, and there are families that I need to talk to and reach. And guess what? There are some kids and families who we had never been able to reach for months, And finally, it's when I text them at 10 o'clock at night, I finally got the family, and we were finally able to begin a communication and a dialogue. Disrupted communication I put in there as a barrier because we work with families who may change phone numbers, who may have lines that are disconnected, who may move and not tell us, who may be doubling up because they don't want to tell us. There could be a combination of reasons as to why there's disrupted communication, but realizing that that's a real barrier that our families have and thinking, how are we going to address that? All right, and I listed some of those here. And then virtual concerns. And some of those virtual concerns are listed here. Access. Do your families all have access to be able to go to the virtual classes, to make sure that they are sorry, as you're seeing my notifications down here, and I should have just paused the video, but I thought they were all done. So that's why I was clicking over there. So I apologize for that. It was real. Virtual concerns, access, making sure you are looking at and trying to address those barriers for families to be able to access schooling and also access you. And then reaching every family. And that's going to lead us into data. Is a barrier in the virtual world is how do you know and how can you reach and access every family? So lastly, and a little quickly, just because I'm a little past time and I apologize for that, but thank you for gifting me your time today. How do you know you're reaching every family? How are you keeping track of that? If it's an old school pen and paper Excel sheet printed out from your student management system like PowerSchool or something like that, where you're just keeping track of how you're communicating with families, that's step one. If that's where you are, that's step one. What kind of data are you collecting? And this goes back to what are you going to do with that data and why are you collecting data in the first place? And knowing that, for me, I want to know who I'm contacting and who's contacting me so that I know who do I need to reach out to, right? And then it helps me too if I'm saying like, wow, none of our Hispanic families are calling. Why? Oh, wait, that's because they know when they call the school, there's nobody who speaks Spanish who answers the phone. Okay, well, we need to problem solve that. Right? And so collecting data also allows you to begin to break down some of those other barriers that you may not have known was a barrier for families. Once you start seeing, we're not getting any families, any of our ESL families. How should we be communicating with them? And that goes to what is your data telling you, right? And allowing you to break down some of those barriers, allowing you to completely reimagine your communication style as a school, as a practitioner, to better reach and then build those stronger relationships with families. And so the last slide is this, and this is my contact information. I welcome a dialogue. I welcome problem solving. I welcome resources. You're going to get a list of resources along with this webinar, and they are phenomenal resources. I am not a fan of just giving you a resource because somebody told me it was a resource. These are resources that I've combed through and really think they are useful tools for you as a practitioner. Thank you so much for watching today. Once again, you are a rock star. You are doing incredible work. You have chosen a vocation to work with families and students, and know that families are complex, amazing, living beings. And if you get to know them and be your true, genuine, and authentic self, that relationship is going to do magical things for you and your school. Have a great day.